Happy 2025, everyone. Now that I am filming this in the new year, I would like to distract myself from current events. Let's talk New Year's resolutions. Whether your goal is to hit the gym or travel the world, we all have a lot of baggage. So I figured I would help us in the best way that I can. In this episode, we will be sipping on an iced elderberry tea and sewing the perfect duffel bag. Welcome to episode 2 of Sip and Sew. Speaking of baggage from the new year, I have gotten sick 3 times since the beginning of 2025. So I am willing to do anything I possibly can to boost my immune system and keep this from happening again. I brewed today's tea using the directions on the package as per usual. To add a little bit of sweetness and full body flavor, I ended up adding 2, well, more like 3 tablespoons of raw honey. I then poured this over a full cup of ice using a mesh strainer to remove any of the leaves and fruit pieces. I will admit, I really like this one, except I will say it is a bit too ginger forward for me. But the sweeter notes of the elderberry paired with the honey bring a nice brightness that I think is perfect going in through winter and into the new spring season. Being that I was sick the majority time that I filmed this, I will say this was the perfect tea pairing to get me through this illness season, even if it was just for moral support. Our pattern this week comes from a blog from the name of Handmadia. This pattern was available for free on their website, even though it just included the circle pattern. The rest of the website does include a tutorial on how to not only assemble this pattern, but also shows you a diagram on how you can draw the rest of the pattern pieces. So it begins with the OG. If you've never sewn with me before, you would know that I use wrapping paper for all of my pattern pieces. I did use my quilting ruler and a Sharpie to go ahead and mark all of the pattern pieces that the original tutorial instructed to do. I then labeled all the pattern pieces with not only the designer of the pattern, but also notating any measurements that I needed to use later, maybe. And I also made a note of the seam allowance that the pattern called for. I did end up printing this pattern at 100% as instructed, and it did print a little funky. What I ended up doing to combat this is I ended up printing 3 extra copies of the pattern, cutting them out and assembling them together in a circle. I laid them on top of each other for a quick fit check before I ended up taping everything else together. Leave it to me to be in the middle of a project and decide to make that project 10 times harder for myself. While I was cutting the pattern for this, I decided I wanted to add pockets to the side. To create the pocket pattern for this side, I folded the side panel in half where the pocket should stop. This was kind of more of like a guideline, and I'm going to be completely honest with you, I eyeballed this. Once this was folded in half taco style, then I was able to find the direct center because I'm going to use something called the cut and slash method. The cut and slash method, especially on simple patterns, is a way to add extra fabric to gather something, or it's a way to add darts into a pattern, which is what we'll be doing today. I cut this pattern up the crease line until the mark we made, and spread this about 2 to 3 inches until I got what I would consider a good pocket pattern. Our pattern is officially done being cut out, assembled, ready to go, ready to cut our fabric. Overall, this tutorial did a very good job with not only giving specific measurements for all the pattern pieces, but also giving clear imagery on what your pattern should look like when they were all laid out. I found that this was very clear instructionally. I find that if you're not used to making your own patterns, this is a very good tutorial to dip your toes into the water into doing that. Tutorial does lose a couple points when it comes to the PDF file. Being that this did not print properly using the instructions from their website, I find that a lot of beginners would find this process a little frustrating and may not know how to finagle it the way that I did. For this project, I used 1 yard of lining, 1.5 yards of canvas, 2 yards of pre-cut piping, and 1 18-inch zipper. The original pattern and tutorial did call for these. It is officially time for us to cut our fabric. I began this process by how I began all of my sewing projects, especially those that have a little bit more expensive fabric. And before I even touch scissors or a rotary cutter to the fabric, I like to lay out all of my pattern pieces ahead of time specifically so I can make sure that I A, have enough fabric, and B, so I can place them in a way to where I can save as much fabric as possible. Call me cheap, but I don't really care. I used a rotary cutter to cut my fabric, or I should say I tried to, because I had flu brain like the entire time I was doing this project, and that doesn't make the best choices sometimes. What I didn't realize is that my rotary cutter blade was tied in too tightly, so when I was trying to cut my fabric, it would not cut. Which, yeah, the scissors won this round. Yep, they sure did. Because as much as I tried to use my rotary cutter for show for you guys, at one point in this project, I just grabbed my scissors because I was tired of trying to make it work. This was the time in the project where I decided to add a phone pocket to the front. I did not take measurements while I was doing this, but it's okay because I took measurements afterwards. Here are the measurements if you would like to add a front pocket to yours. It's very simple. Just cut out a square. It should look like this. The original pattern also called for something called herringbone ribbon, which I could not find this. One of my favorite things about sewing is like taking these opportunities, just being a little crafty and just deciding to make your own. I did want to serge all of my pieces, specifically because I opted out of using batting as well. And also, look how satisfying it is. Like, wow, it's just so, there's just something about freshly serged fabric that's I did do every single piece, including the bottom pieces that are supposed to be cut out of oilcloth. I thought oilcloth was going to be ugly, especially because all the oilcloth that I could find around me looks like early 2000s kitchens with chickens. Not really a fan, not my personal brand. I ended up cutting out 2 pieces of canvas that were the same diameter that I asked for in the oilcloth, and then I serged them together in like a sandwich, specifically so it would be like thicker and more durable. Moving on to the next step of our project, I began to sew it together. Starting with the 2 outer pieces, took those and sewed down the side seam as per instructed in the original tutorial. As we have already gone on a full tangent about, I do not have the herringbone tape, which means we have to make our own. To do this, I had cut out 2-inch strips that were a little bit longer than I needed for this project. I then used a bias tape maker to make bias tape out of these strips. I will say that I was not expecting canvas to be so difficult to use with the bias tape tool. I ended up having a really hard time trying to get it through the bias tape maker. I ended up taking and doubling up some thread and a needle, tying a knot, and then yanking it through the bias tape maker until it came out the other end. And by then, it was easy to just press and continue using the bias tape maker as per usual. Once all these were pressed, I had 4 of them just because you need to be able to sandwich them together. So you have 2 full straps for your bag. And I also took this opportunity to iron the center pocket that I created and hem that to get it ready to install on the front of the bag while we install the strap. I used a chalk marker to mark all the placements for not only the pocket itself, but for all of these straps. I made a mark on each one of the straps where they end on the bag. So the last place where these will be attached, I created a straight line. I then pinned my straps together ugly sides to ugly sides, so my pretty sides were on the outside. And I sewed them together using a hem guide foot in this sort of like rectangular fashion. And I repeated that on both straps. So now instead of 4 pieces, I should have 2 pieces. And yes, you should have some flappy tails on the end. This should give us very cleanly put together straps, and they should look very nice. No extra seam allowances or anything on the outside. So once these like outer straps were created, I then pinned them to the bag on the markings that we made earlier. At this point, I used a hem guide foot to top stitch the straps onto the bag. Once I reached the top point where we had originally made that straight line, I ended up sewing a box like this specifically so it would have like that double reinforcement that you see on a lot of projects. And this is basically to give our straps some really good structure to make sure that our bag can hold a lot. I then pinned the pocket to the bag and stitched this. I then hemmed the top and the bottom of the oilcloth piece just using an iron before I then pinned it onto the bag. I used a mallet to then hammer all these pieces, just because when you have a lot of cloth, you kind of have to beat it into compliance. I then gave everything a final press before top stitching the oilcloth or bottom reinforcement piece onto the back. Now we get to insert the zipper. So I'm inserting the zipper the same way I insert every single zipper. It's just my method. Everyone has a different method. This is just the method that I have found that works for me. I begin by pinning the zipper to the fabric pretty sides together, and then flipping the bag inside out, and then pinning the zipper on the other side, like pretty sides to pretty sides, so right sides together. Then, being that this zipper does detach at the bottom, just to make life a little bit easier, I completely unzipped the bag, and then I sewed down our pin lines here. Once this is sewn, I then pushed my seam allowance over the zipper teeth. So instead of trying to sew it together and then try to seam rip out the center later, I just push it over, pin it down, sew it through the sewing machine. Really quick, really fast, really easy. You know for a fact that your zipper is going to be covered by the fabric. Easy peasy. At this point, I reconnected the zipper and tested it out, moving the zipper back and forth just to make sure that it wasn't getting stuck in any places. We now get to sew our side pockets, which was super fun. I started with doing a rolled hem on the top of our pocket sides, the same way we did with the front pocket. I then pinned the pocket circles to the big circles. And I pinned this in 3 places. One was on each side of the hem, and the other was on the bottom dart to make sure that it was secured. I then ran a basting stitch around this pocket before I sewed on my piping. I sewed in the piping using a basting stitch. I sewed the piping all the way around until I reached the center bottom that I had started with, and I stopped maybe about an inch before I got there. I then seam ripped out the piping until I hit the stitch line where I'd stopped. I snipped the piping where it met the piping from before, and I folded the bias tape that comes around the piping around that initial part. I feel like it makes more sense when you look at what I'm doing. And then I did use my scissors to help guide me here, just because my fingers are a tad bit fat when it comes to doing stuff like this. And then I went ahead and stitched all the way around, making sure to back tack and sealing that in, giving me a nice, clean, professional polish to the end of that piping. When I was done with each of the pockets, I pinned these to the bag, and then slowly and steadily, I sewed around the circles. This was very difficult. I will admit I had to do it more than once. Go slow. The more pins, the merrier here. It will save you a lot of time. To sew the lining, I began by stitching the long sides together like we did on the outer fabric. I then sewed the top of this piece, sewing an inch on each side. I then pinned each circle to the lining as we had done with the original bag. Again, taking our time here and using as many pins as possible. And then I sewed slowly and surely until it was finished. Once this was done, I put the lining inside of the bag, making sure to line them up ugly sides to ugly sides. So on the outside of the bag, pretty fabric, on the inside of the bag, pretty fabric, and began to hand sew this into place. And basically we're hiding all the interior seams with the lining. That is how I made the best duffel bag ever. I rate this pattern 5 out of 5 thimbles. This tutorial was very well written and the pattern was easy to assemble. Although I would not recommend this project for a very baby beginner, I find that this is like the perfect intermediate project for someone who wants to challenge themselves just a little bit more. It was a really good intermediate project that took me about 8 hours to completely assemble from start to finish. If you like this pattern and you would like to make your own duffel bag, the pattern is in the description below. It is 100% free. Go ahead and give them some love because I think this project was phenomenal. If you have any free patterns or beverages you would like me to try, please drop them in the comment section below, because whether you would like to sip or sew along, we'd love to have you here. Thank you so much for joining me, and we will see you all next time. Goodbye, chat.